What would I have done differently for the Buffalo Bills than Brandon Beane in the 2023 NFL Draft? I'm sharing the picks I would have made today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Would like to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, folks, I am very excited for today's conversation. I am going to go head-to-head with Bills general manager Brandon Beane and tell you exactly what I would have done in the 2023 NFL Draft if I were making the picks. And for those of you who have been listening to this podcast for a number of years, you know that I don't do this alone. I bring along Bruce Nolan, the outstanding host of the Bruce exclusive podcast and the Buffalo Rumblings podcast feed. And he also shares his picks. We've done this now. This will be the fourth year in a row of doing this. And if anyone's going to go head to head with Big Baller Beane, it's going to be me and Bruce Nolan. Bruce, thanks for being willing to do this again for a fourth year in a row.
I am so willing to do it, and I'm more willing to do it when you open the podcast the way you did, because it really sounds like you're the one stepping into traffic and I'm just watching with popcorn. And so the way that you frame it, I think, leaves you much more open to criticism than me, and I am all for that.
Well, what they don't know is I'm dragging you along with me, and I appreciate that very much. Now, listen, we normally do this pretty close to the after the draft when when it concludes, but Bruce has had some personal circumstances that I wanted to be sensitive to, that he's been working through, and this is the time that was appropriate for us to record. I know that we've had a lot of people reach out and say, Joe, when's it happening? Are you going to get together with Bruce and do the thing where you tell us the picks you would have made? Well, yes, just a little bit later than usual. And so let's do it, Bruce. Let's first start by taking ourselves back to the end of April before the draft was going to happen. And your thoughts, what were your expectations? What were your hopes for what Brandon Beane would accomplish with the 2023 NFL Draft?
It was one of those circumstances leading up to the draft when you think about needs, and Brandon Beane likes to fill as many needs as possible before the draft. And you start to think about deep versus wide. And you think, okay, do I have deep needs or do I have wide needs? Like, how many different things could Brandon Beane do with each one of these picks where I would go, yeah, okay. Yeah, I get it. Right? There's a much wider net versus historically when you and I have had this conversation, I was screaming CB2, 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 CB2 over and over and over again. And you will see that when we reflect back on past years. But in this case, it was almost like anything but CB2. And I'd be like, yeah, okay, I get it. I understand. I would have been a little weird if you would have taken a left tackle, someone who purely projects as a left tackle. Would have been a little weird if you would have taken a running back or a quarterback. But aside from that, I'm like, no, I can pretty much see it. If Brandon Beane would have taken an interior offensive lineman in the first round, you would have gone, okay, I see the path. If they would have taken a linebacker, you say, okay, I see the path. An edge rusher, I see the path. A safety, I see the path. And so on and so forth. And with the exception of linebacker, which I don't think was as big of a deal to the team as it was to the fan base leading up to the draft and all the Jack Campbell conversations, Drew Sanders conversations surrounding that. I think that when I came into the draft, I thought to myself, yeah, I've got preferences, but because of how shallow but wide the need base is, there's so many different ways that I could be talked into going, yeah, all right, I get it.
Yeah, there was definitely a number of paths that made sense for the Bills. But when I go back and I consider what I was hoping for, I remember being very, very convicted that my biggest concerns for the team were on defense. And it was the defensive tackle, it was edge, it was linebacker. And then, of course, I was interested in maybe some O-line upgrades, certainly another weapon in the passing game. Those are things that interested me, but my biggest concerns were on defense. But I will say this. One of my big talking points right before the draft was, while I'm very concerned about the defense, I also recognize the abundance of good free agents that are still available on the defensive side of the football, in particular the defensive line. I said, well, if he doesn't pick an edge rusher or defensive tackle, Leonard Floyd's out there, Poona Ford's out there, and of course there's other players, but those were specific names that I targeted, and they were my preferences at both position. And so with the benefit of hindsight, I can say that, yes, my biggest concerns were on defense, but I was also very mindful of the rich pool of free agents that were available, and Brandon Beane certainly agrees and tapped into that to solidify some of those position groups. And so that benefit of hindsight is definitely something that we have to be mindful of with this conversation, because Brandon Beane has to make these choices in real time. We have the benefit of seeing exactly what happened and adjusting our picks appropriately. So we definitely have an advantage over Brandon Beane, and we'll acknowledge that. But the fun part is about to happen here. We're going to tell everybody who would we have picked in those moments over Brandon Beane or in agreement with Brandon Beane. There's been a couple of years where there was a lot of congruency between the way that we saw it versus Brandon Beane. The other note that I want to bring up here before we get into it is I don't know who Bruce has picked. He has no idea who I have picked. So there's a big element of suspense here that I'm excited to share what I did, but I also can't wait to see what Bruce did. So let's end the suspense. Bruce, you're the guest. I'm going to let you go first here with the first round pick the Bills had this year. Was at number 25 overall. They traded up and got Dalton Kincaid. Your opportunity is here to make that pick instead of Dalton Kincaid, or continue with it. The floor is yours.
I'm going chalk. I'm taking Dalton Kincaid. And the reason that is because I really don't like this board for the Bills. I said it when it got close to the Buffalo Bills pick, that there wasn't going to be a player that I was like, yeah, all right, let's go. My dreams are coming true. My Twitter account is not going to light up like a Christmas tree the way it did when the Buffalo Bills finally drafted a long, athletic cornerback in round 1. And I thought my phone was going to blow up because everyone was like, Bruce, are you okay? How are you holding up? And I said, this is the greatest moment of my life. But ultimately, this came down to two players for me, Dalton Kincaid and Nolan Smith. And I'm trying to take myself out of the mindset that I now know that the Buffalo Bills have selected a tight end and then doubled down in the free agent market post-draft and gotten Leonard Floyd. So I'm trying to get myself out of that and say, okay, if I hadn't known that at the time, what would I have done? And I think the answer is I really wanted a pass-catching weapon for Josh Allen. That's what I wanted. And I think if this was a different tight end, I probably would have felt different. But the run on receivers from 20, 21, 22, 23 made me feel a certain way about the Buffalo Bills pick. And I looked at the board at that time because I was thinking everything's lining up perfectly. And all of a sudden, Seattle, Chargers, Ravens, Vikings, I'm like, everything is terrible all of a sudden for somebody who wants either an offensive lineman or a receiver high. And so when I look at this situation, I go, okay, if Dalton Kincaid had wide receiver next to his name, would I feel strongly about it? And the answer is I probably would. And I am a significant proponent of 12 personnel. I always have been. Anyone who's been following the show for years knows that I'm a 12 personnel guy. And so for me, I'm trying to take off the, well, what if he doesn't get used correctly hat and say, okay, I'm just going to just ignore that for a second. I want as good of a pass catching weapon as I can get for Josh Allen. In this case, the answer was Dalton Kincaid. And so knowing that there wasn't a really exciting option for me at other positions of need, I went with the best pass catcher who was available at the time, which in this case was Dalton Kincaid.
Well, I'm certainly a fan of that selection. We'll focus a little bit more on us reflecting on each other's selections later on. But I've certainly spent a lot of time in the recent months reflecting on the pick of Dalton Kincaid, and I've certainly talked myself into being very excited about what he can mean for this offense. Now, when it comes to me making my pick for the Bills under these circumstances, there's really not a whole lot of suspense. I spent a lot of time before the draft ranking players specifically for the Bills. I put out a Buffalo Bills specific draft board, and I told you, peel them off one at a time. The one that's the highest is the one that I would pick. And so being true to what I said, the player that I would pick is the other player you were considering, which is Nolan Smith, the edge rusher from Georgia, who was number 7 overall on my Bill-specific big board. I'm a big fan of Nolan Smith. I can't believe that he's on the Eagles. And it's funny, my entire narrative with Nolan Smith during the pre-draft process was, I think this is a more explosive, more powerful version of Hassan Reddick, who seemingly Philadelphia drafted to probably replace Hassan Reddick once that contract expires. But me and my concerns on defense, it definitely marries up with that. I wanted another edge rusher. I wanted a bendy, bursty pass rusher to kind of give the Bills more complementary skill sets. They've certainly accomplished that now with the addition of Leonard Floyd, but very clearly, based on the way that my board stacked, the pick would be Nolan Smith if I were calling the shots. And Dalton Kincaid, I had a late first-round grade on him. It wasn't like I thought that was not appropriate value, but, I had a really high grade on Nolan Smith. And if I'm putting myself back into that spot, he would have been the player that I selected. All right, folks, we're going to get to the rest of the picks here in the next segment. But first, I do need to tell you all about FanDuel, which is America's #1 sportsbook. Baseball season is in full swing, and there's simply no better place to get in on the action than over at FanDuel, because right now new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today. Folks, I love betting over at FanDuel. They have great promotions every single day. It's a safe, secure, easy-to-use app. And the football's futures bets are available for you right now. So whether you want to get in on some player props, projected stats when it comes to receiving, rushing, passing numbers, week 1 odds, you can get in on the over-under projections for team win totals. So much to take advantage of over at FanDuel. So don't miss your chance to snag that no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. It's FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Bruce, I'm guessing you probably thought I was going to go Nolan Smith.
I did.
Yeah, when you said you were thinking Dalton Kincaid or Nolan Smith, I'm like, all right, well, you should pretty much vibe with the selection that I made here, which gets us to the next part. We're going to rip through the rest of these picks here in this segment. And you went first with the first pick. I'll take the honors here on the second pick, number 59 overall. The Bills drafted Brandon Beane, drafted Osiris Torrence, the guard out of Florida. I would not have picked Osiris Torrence, the guard out of Florida. I would have picked Drew Sanders, the linebacker out of Arkansas. And this just is a reflection of my, big concern with the linebacker position that I still have right now as we record this podcast in late June. I feel like that's just a glaring hole for the Bills. There's unproven options, and not that Drew Sanders reflects a proven option, but he does reflect a skill set that intrigues me, a guy with upside, athleticism. I believe that this team's going to be more multiple with their fronts. I think there's going to be more simulated pressures. I think that plays well into Drew Sanders. Now, he has his warts as a player. Missed tackles were a concern. Not a lot of experience, right? He's all upside and projection. But I think in the second round, I can get comfortable with that. He wasn't a player that I thought was appropriate in the first round. But in the second round, with him being available, with him being really the only other player that I thought was a viable option to be a starting Mike linebacker for the Buffalo Bills, that's where I settled. So for me, my top 2 picks, Nolan Smith, the edge rusher from Georgia, Drew Sanders, the linebacker from Arkansas. Bruce, Dalton Kincaid first for you, and now your chance to make a second-round pick.
Historically, I have gone very hard to the left when it comes to Brandon Beane. And the last 2 years, it's been a little bit different when I've compared what I would have done to what actually happened. I'm picking Osiris Torrence, and I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to have a really boring discussion, but I have to be intellectually honest. And the fact of the matter is that I was a little bit cold on Osiris Torrence in the first round. Not because I didn't think he was a first-round talent, but because I had concerns about the fit. If you take a player like Osiris Torrence and you plug him into an offensive line that is primarily people who don't look like Osiris Torrence. I made a funny meme on Twitter immediately after the pick of a bunch of penguins sitting around and then a polar bear with a penguin nose on him and talking about how Osiris Torrence was a strange fit. So I feel a lot more comfortable with that in the second round. like a lot more comfortable with that in the second round. I think Torrence is a player that is admittedly different than what you have, but simply from a talent level, I think you can make an argument he has the opportunity to be one of the better interior offensive linemen in this class. And if you have concerns about Josh Allen's weapons and you have concerns about Josh Allen's offensive line, you have an opportunity to correct both of those issues in the first 2 rounds with both players who a lot of people thought were mid to late first round picks. You see lots of mocks out there with the Washington Commanders. In fact, someone in this room right now mocked the Washington Commanders to take O'Cyrus Torrence in round 1. So if that tells you the way that I thought the NFL would think about him, that is a steal, in my opinion, based on a value proposition. And the fit becomes a little bit less of a concern because of the value. You're like, yeah, I'm not going to take Bijan Robinson at 5, but if he's there in the 3rd round, it's that kind of, discussion. And so I know that's boring, and I didn't want it to be boring, but I couldn't take a left-hand turn just to be different. I had to make sure that I stayed intellectually honest. And the truth is that O'Cyrus Torrence was the best player on my board at that time.
All right. So 2 for 2, aligning with Brandon Beane. You have honors here with this 3rd round pick. Brandon Beane selected Dorian Williams, the linebacker out of Tulane, number 91 overall. You going 3 for 3?
I am not going 3 for 3. This is where we take a sharp left-hand turn, right? I'm taking Siaki Ika, defensive tackle, Baylor. And the reason I'm doing that is exactly one of the things that you talked about. I have meaningful concerns about this interior defensive line moving forward into the future. The fact that Ed Oliver had not been extended at this time matters, but also Ed Oliver and Siaki Ika do not play the same position. I do think with Ika, I think you get an opportunity to get a little bit more push on passing downs than if you took someone like Broderick Martin from Western Kentucky, who's also a popular mid-round pick, or Jacqueline Roy from LSU, who I still to this day believe the Buffalo Bills would have picked in the 5th if the Vikings hadn't taken him right ahead of him. I still believe to this day that was probably the pick. The way Brandon Beane talked about it, we had him in for a visit. I feel like that would have been the pick if he would have been there. So for me, I'm taking Siaki Ika. I would very much like to extend the Bills' current one-tech defensive tackle. I don't really care the fact that he's in his early 30s. I think that's a position that we have shown defensive line in general ages very well. And I think you've seen consistently the fact that one-tech defensive tackles can play well into their mid-30s. So if you threw a 2-year extension at Daquan Jones, I would be thrilled with that. But that hasn't happened, which means I finally got the one tech of my dreams, and I immediately start panicking about losing it. And so this is going to be the pick because I desperately need to have something in my pocket in the event that an extension for Daquan Jones does not come around. And if you don't, in this case, want to invest meaningful money in both defensive starting tackle spots, and you want to have somebody there waiting in the wings, ready to move forward.
All right. I, in the 3rd round, did not pick Dorian Williams. That's going to be a surprise to nobody. I went with Darnell Washington, the tight end from Georgia. This is a player that I became very infatuated with during the process. Just a really, really unique player with his size, his length, his athleticism. I mean, from day one, you get an impact blocker, and I know that doesn't excite everybody, but when you want to push the ball off tackle, when you want to run out of some spread formations, a guy like Darnell Washington, who's like 270 pounds, that blocks like he's a offensive tackle, would be such a big upgrade for the Bills and their ability to get push and win the edge on some of their outside runs. Now they have more speed in the backfield, and you get more excited about that idea. The other thing that I thought Darnell Washington could bring was just a very steady middle of the field target, right? He's going to be a size athletic mismatch, really good hands, and I loved his ability to beat zone coverage, a really natural feel for coverage rotations and where to sit, very quarterback-friendly tight end. And I think you would lean into his inline ability and then use Dawson Knox as more of a flex piece. So a lot of the dynamics that we talk about with Kincaid and Knox, except for in this world, Knox becomes Kincaid and Washington becomes Knox. And so I was very interested in more 12 personnel. And this is a player that achieves a lot of what we've talked about but in a different way because it frees up Knox. Now, I don't think that Knox has the receiving upside that Kincaid does, but I also don't think that either of them projects in line in a way that Washington does. And I think that's a key component of some of those principles that you want to encapsulate with the 12 personnel lean. So I go Darnell Washington, the tight end from Georgia, in the 3rd round, which gets us now to the 5th round, number 150 overall. Brandon Beane selected Justin Shorter, the wide receiver from Florida. I am not picking Justin Shorter. I'm going with Asim Richards, the offensive lineman from North Carolina. I think that Richards is one of my favorite prospects through the process. Really got familiar with him at the Senior Bowl and then went back and watched the tape. And there's a lot to like. He's a very tenacious player, offers a lot of versatility. I think he can legitimately play four positions, which helps value right with your roster with versatility, but also when you're trying to sort out your best 5 and where to play guys, that's always very, very helpful. Not that I thought that Asim Richards had a chance to start year 1 for the Bills, but in time, right, a developmental backup early that has starter traits. I really like him. I just like his temperament as a football player. So for mid-round offensive lineman with starting appeal to me, I thought this was kind of a very versatile option to bring into the mix that would potentially even have a chance to get a jersey on game day as a rookie as a 5th round pick. So Asim Richards, my pick over Justin Shorter in the 5th round.
I like it. I think anytime you have an opportunity to get a mid-round player who can come in and compete right away in the offensive line, you just stack those players. You just stack them up. And for me, when it comes to round 5, I'm taking Henry 2020, linebacker, Alabama. So I'm filling a linebacker need here. But the important thing for me is when addressing linebacker, what is the concern? Is the concern ceiling? Is the concern floor? And I think for me, when I looked at the linebacker need, I think first off, we mentioned that I don't think the Bills viewed it as significantly as we did, but also my concern is floor. My concern is worst case scenario. So I play this game with my wife all the time. When you're trying to plan for an unknown, you say, okay, what's the worst that can happen? You accommodate for that. And then anything after that is gravy. Anything above that is gravy because you've already made a plan for the worst case scenario. That's Henry 2020 for me. I don't think anybody is ever going to look at his profile and think to myself, this is going to be a dynamic playmaking linebacker in the NFL. But he is instinctually sound. He's tactically sound. He's where he's supposed to be, when he's supposed to be there. And I would feel like a nice warm blanket with Henry 2020. He is the last person in the tier of linebackers that makes me go, he could compete. Like he could compete. I'm not going to feel excited if he wins the middle linebacker position, that I'm going to have a dynamic playmaking player at that position. But I'm also not going to be freaking out about it. And when you have an opportunity to get a player like that in round 5 with a high floor, I think you have to know in the day 3 of your picks, am I shooting for a high floor? Or am I shooting for a high ceiling? And with linebacker, I'm shooting for a high floor in this case. I just want to plug it in case the other people who we have don't rise to the occasion. Because ideally, you spent a 3rd round pick last year on Terrell Bernard, right? You're like, okay, hopefully he can be a guy. But what if he can't, right? But what if he can't? That's what I want to accommodate for. And that's the player I get from Henry 2020. And I'm not operating under any sort of delusions that he's going to make meaningful plays in the run game where he's going to thump downhill and he's going to make really significant plays on the ball in zone coverage. He's just going to be where he's supposed to be, when he's supposed to be there, and he's going to keep the position from being a disaster. And to me, if you can get a vet-like security blanket from a rookie in the 5th round at a position of need, you do it.
Man, now you got me all nervous. Keep the position from being a disaster. I don't know if the Bills' current options can do that, Bruce. I don't know. But obviously they felt some type of way about their options because they're rolling with them, right? So that gives me some level of confidence. All right, let's take these 2 7th-round picks as a package deal here. I'll let you go first here. I'll set the stage here. Brandon Beane with 2 7th-round picks. Number 230 overall goes Nick Broeker, the guard offensive lineman out of Ole Miss at 252. Cornerback Alex Austin out of Oregon State. What would be your package of 2 7th-round picks?
I'm going back to the well. I'm taking Nick Broeker. I like Nick Broeker. I thought Nick Broeker was a early day 3 pick. And I think he's someone who has a chance to be a practice squad player year 1, potentially jump into an Ike Butker style role. I think if Nick Broeker ends up being an Ike Butker kind of player, which is ironic because they both have the OE in their name, that, I think there's something there. I haven't figured out quite what it is yet, but I think maybe there's a connection there. I'm not finding out. But we throw around the term 5 position versatility. We throw that around all the time, and the vast majority of the time, it's not true. It's a little bit like when you hear someone say about a running back, "Oh man, he could legitimately play wide receiver." It's a lie. Like that's not true. Like the routes that he's running are not wide receiver routes. Stop saying that. But in some cases, it's actually kind of true. And I think you could play Broeker at a lot of different players. I think he's somebody who profiles as that Ryan Batesian, Ike Butker player that can be a versatile backup. We talk about this all the time. It's reinforced all the time by offensive line coaches, head coaches, general managers. If you're going to be a backup lineman in the NFL, you have to wear multiple hats. You have to. And so that's exactly the kind of player that I want to take in the 7th round. With my last pick, I am taking Eku Leota, edge rusher, Auburn. I love to take players in the 7th round that I think should have gone higher. And I think if he doesn't tear his pec, I think he goes higher. I think he goes markedly higher, like round 4, potentially, if he doesn't tear a pec. This is a player who I think has good length, which you want. I think he's got good burst. I think he's got good motor. I think he's got good bend. I think that he's not really a player that you would want to have come into a base 4-3 end. But you mentioned with Nolan Smith that you wanted somebody a little bit longer, a little bit more explosive. Obviously, the Bills are okay with that. They signed Von Miller to a massive deal. We thought they had a kind of a type, right, with these heavy-handed compression-style rushers. If I can have an opportunity to have somebody learn from Von Miller, I want to have a player who is long and bendy and explosive, and I want to have those things. I think he profiles as that kind of player, and I think much like the Ravens pick in round 7, which I absolutely despised, by the way, because the Ravens, they do this all the time. They take these players late in the draft that they can redshirt for a year, and I just scream at them because they're constantly playing one step ahead of everybody else when they took Andrew Voorhees. This is a little bit of an Andrew Voorheesian pick for me. And so for me, my 7th pick, my final pick, a 7th round pick, my final pick is Eku Leota, pass rusher out of Auburn.
All right, my package of 7th round picks is as follows. Pick 230, I'm going Brandon Hill, the safety out of Pittsburgh, was one of my favorite sleeper prospects in this draft. Good size and athleticism. You would like a little bit more playmaking from him at Pitt, but they played him in some challenging alignments to really showcase a lot of that, a lot of deeper stuff, staying over top, staying leveraged. But when he got a chance to like trigger and play downhill, you saw physicality, you saw tackling ability, a ton of range as well. I think there's just a lot of good football ahead for Brandon Hill that I think at a minimum is a good special teams player that can serve as a one high safety that even has some man coverage appeal from the slot. And I like that from him. And as a guy that you could get into the mix right now with Poyer and Hyde and, maybe groom him as a potential successor for one of those players. So I like him as a rosterable 7th round pick. And then my other 7th round pick, instead of Alex Austin, I'm going Grant DuBose, the wide receiver from Charlotte. I think a lot of the stuff that I talk about with Justin Shorter and his path to rosterability as wide receiver 6, adding size, adding special teams, right? That 4th down ability is what you're looking for in your depth at receiver. I like what he would offer in this scenario. A good story, a super competitive guy, had a chance to be around at the Senior Bowl. He's got some Bills DNA to him that I think makes a lot of sense. So I think he would probably be the leader in the clubhouse to be wide receiver 6 over some of the candidates that the Bills currently have, minus Justin Shorter. So when I think late round picks, I think roster ability, and I think special teams and some redeeming qualities that give me some developmental appeal. And I feel like I get those boxes checked with Brandon Hill and Grant DuBose. All right, folks, so we've given you our picks. So coming up after a very quick break, we're going to reflect on the picks that we made, right? I'm going to critique Bruce's draft. He's going to critique mine. And then we're going to reflect on previous years. Like we mentioned, we've been doing this for 4 years now. So we got to go back and look and see how we're doing versus Brandon Beane after a very, very quick break. All right, folks, welcome back. It's time to, I guess, critique each other. So Bruce, you've seen my draft. I've seen yours at this point. I'll critique yours first. I'll do that. So your picks were Dalton Kincaid, Osiris Torrence, Siaki Ika, the defensive tackle from Baylor, Henry To'oTo'o, linebacker Alabama in the 5th round. Your 2 7th-round picks were Nick Broeker, who the Bills did draft, and then Iku Leota, edge out of Auburn. What I really like about what you've accomplished here is I think that you did something smart in not necessarily like repeating the first 2 picks that Brandon Beane made, but the impact, the areas that you addressed, I think were good for Buffalo to do, right? I mean, I've been through this. The Bills are one of only a couple of teams that invested their first 2 picks on offensive players. And for as much concern as I have over defense, and those are certainly subsided now that the Bills have added some players in free agency after the draft, I think getting that pass catching weapon, priority number 1, was a great box to check with that first pick, especially getting Dalton Kincaid. And then, you have an opportunity to get a big time physical, powerful guard added to the mix here. And the Bills have had a lot of instability at guard, and maybe Torrence could come in and be a pillar for the first time in a long time at guard. Iku Leota late, I think, is a great pick that you broke down exactly why. Upside, the injury kind of pushed him down. I had a chance to meet Iku at the Senior Bowl. He's an awesome guy. Talked to his position coach at Auburn, and they rave about him, right? There's a lot of good there. And I think that as a late round pick gives me a lot of appeal. What I don't like about your draft is Ika. I just wasn't a fan. 3rd round's a lot more appropriate value than I think where the mocks were kind of trending towards him. I get that he's a big A-gap defender, and I certainly understand the need there, but I just want to see a more like steady anchor and a guy with a little bit more movement skills. So that would be my critique. The rest of it I really like. I think even To'oTo'o in the 5th round is a high floor player that at a minimum can play special teams, like you mentioned, going to be where he's supposed to be. Thought he was a lot better in 2021 than 2022, but 2021 still happened, and I like that tape. I thought he was a day 2 pick on, after studying him in 2021. It was the entire defense in Alabama regressed last year, like literally every single player. So, there's something to be said for that, but overall, I like your haul. It makes a lot of sense to me. And I think going back to Dalton Kincaid in the 1st round and, the excitement that's been created through his arrival and doubling down on that, I think makes a lot of sense. So I'll give you the floor. You could say whatever you want about my picks. Again, I'll recap them for everybody. Nolan Smith, the edge rusher, Georgia. Drew Sanders, linebacker, Arkansas. Darnell Washington, tight end, Georgia. Those are my first 3 picks. Then 5th round, Asim Richards, an offensive lineman from North Carolina. My 2 7th-round picks, Brandon Hill, safety, Pitt. Grant Dubose, wide receiver, Charlotte.
Let me ask you before I go to that. Would you have felt more comfortable if I'd gone Broderick Martin?
No.
Okay.
No, and Bruce, I went through this project, preparing for this and thinking to myself, what defensive tackle can I get at some point that I like? And I just didn't like these players this year.
My options were taking Roy 2 rounds too high, right? Or taking Ika or Martin. And I was like, I like Ika better, so I'm taking Ika. And I just, it was a very strange position I got put into. And I will still say, I believe Roy would have been the pick.
No, I don't think you're wrong.
5.
I don't think you're wrong about that.
The first thing and most obvious thing that I liked about your haul is Nolan Smith. So I went back and forth between Dalton Kincaid and Nolan Smith. Nolan Smith, I did not think was going to be a player who was going to even be there when the Bills picked at 27. And then when they trade up, I didn't think he would still be there at that point when they trade up to either. Like I thought he was going to go top 16.
Yeah.
And so the ability to get a player like Nolan Smith is important. I think the ability to get a player in the 1st round is important because if you notice, it didn't fall for me to get an edge rusher until round 7. So every step along the way, I was like, I want to get an edge rusher. I want to get an edge rusher. And it just didn't happen. That's the reason why you take them high. That's the reason why you take them in the 1st round. So the fact of the matter is my draft did not check the box because listen, love me some taking an opportunity on a 7th-round pick who had a value suppressed because of a pec injury, right? But Iku doesn't make you feel good about that room for 2024 and 2025.
Yeah.
He doesn't make you think, okay, well, AJ Epinesa and Boogie Basham, if they don't take the next step, we're fine. We got Iku. Like that's not a position, but you would say we're fine. We got Nolan Smith. That's the way you would feel about that. And that's a huge load off of my mind. taking Igor Smith. The thing I don't love about your draft is that the experienced weapons are Darnell Washington is potential when it comes to him as a pass catching weapon. Like you said, you're getting him with a higher floor knowing, hey, he's at least going to come in and block, right? He's going to come in and be a meaningful player. He's also a freak. So you think you can project those things much like you did with the last tight end that the Buffalo Bills got, who did not come to the Buffalo Bills with meaningful college production in the receiving game. You and I have talked ad nauseum about the fact that Dawson Knox college film was horrible to watch because that Ole Miss offense was like watching paint dry, and he caught 4 passes. I mean, it was terrible. It was entirely a projection. And so Darnell Washington at least comes from a Georgia offense that was not like watching paint dry and at least has those tools, and it's a projection. But you don't feel good about plugging him in as a pass catching weapon and go, okay, I feel good about pass catchers now because I did this pick. You circle back with a wide receiver who I actually really like in the 7th round out of Charlotte. But ultimately, if you came into this draft and you're like, hey, I want to get stronger in weaponry, you come out of it and go, we may have gotten stronger on weaponry. I'll let you know later. And that's the difference.
Yeah.
And so I think the important thing to note about our 2 drafts, and I think it really is kind of cool that it came out this way, is it's an opportunity cost thing. There is no possible way for you to have gotten the strengths of my draft and the strengths of yours. That's not a thing. You weren't going to have that. You weren't going to get an elite upper tier pass rusher. You weren't going to get a strong interior offensive line present and also get an elite pass catching weapon. That wasn't going to happen. If anything, this speaks to the opportunity cost associated and intrinsic with the NFL draft, because they're almost inverts of each other. You took your edge rusher in the first. I took my edge rusher in the last. You took your pass catching weapons in the 3rd and 7th. I took mine in the 1st. So they're almost mirror images of each other. And I think that that's probably important when it comes to you can't accomplish everything you want. This is an example of that.
Well, Bruce, obviously I signed DeAndre Hopkins after the draft and
obviously,
yeah, of course. I mean, I knew that would be a very viable
possibility.
I just lose. Well, I figured it's a fair critique. I didn't get any meaningful pass catching options. I didn't. That's a very fair critique. And I know that most people wanted that. I get it. But for me, I mean, if it's, and that's why I can appreciate your pick of Dalton Kincaid, because if not Dalton Kincaid, then yeah, it gets dicey. It gets very dicey. All right. So like we've mentioned, we've done this for a number of years now. And if you're following us on YouTube right now, you can see side by side the picks that Brandon Beane has made, the picks that I've made, and the picks that Bruce has made. And so we get a chance now to once again revisit this and see how we're doing versus Brandon Beane. We have, I don't want to sit here and go through every single pick, obviously. But Bruce, as you consider what you've done versus Brandon Beane, what are some of those big prevailing thoughts for you?
I feel really good about 2020 and 2021, specifically as it relates to, it's almost like a Gabriel Davis versus Christian Fulton discussion when it comes to 2020. But I think Tyler Bass puts Beane over the edge. I think I'm feeling a little bit better about Isaiah Hodgins in the 6th at that point. And I think that might be a vindication for me. 2021, I feel very strong about. It's just Asante Samuel and Creed Humphrey by itself is enough for me to not really plant my flag and say, I think I win, but I think you have 2 upper echelon players at their positions. And, don't look now, but Israel Mukuamu has played some quality snaps during his time with the Cowboys. So Shaka Toney, not so much, but I think this was a good draft for me relative to what I saw from Beane. I think that some of the situations that we need to talk about relate to, these are not cumulative. So it's not like, oh, well, if Bruce would have done this, we would have had Christian Fulton and Asante Samuel and Kyer Elam, because that's not true. Every draft we did was taken with the idea that our previous draft was not canon, that Beane's previous draft was what was canon. So like we say, you have the benefit of hindsight, right? It also creates this weird scenario where I end up with cornerbacks being taken first in the 2020, 2021, and 2022 draft. I think you take a player like Nakobe Dean round 2 of 2022, we're having a very different discussion this time around. Obviously, we're not taking Henry 2020 at that point. So overall, I feel pretty good about it. I like the pick of Christian Benford, I think came through for both of us. So I think all three of us having Christian Benford, the same pick in the 6th round, is a fun little thing for 2022. Very rarely do we all agree on a mid to late day 3 pick. So I think that's kind of fun.
When I look at this through the picks that I made versus Beane, a lot stands out to me. For 2020, we all get to take the L on Zach Moss. So
we do.
that is what it is. I mean, certainly Christian Fulton and you and I both picked over AJ Epinesa. That's aging fairly well. But I like my pick in the 5th round of Donovan Peoples-Jones, a wide receiver out of Michigan. And he came on and had a nice year for the Browns last season, and I like where he's at. I mean, I think continuing with Tyler Bass was another thing that I did well in 2020. 2021, you liked your first 2 picks of Asante Samuel and Creed Humphrey. You should. Brandon Beane picked Greg Rousseau and Carlos Basham. You should certainly feel good about Greg Rousseau. I like my first 2 picks as well. Tevin Jenkins was my top pick, and he really came on for the Bears last year. It looks like he's going to be a pillar for that offensive line. And then Aleem McNeil, the defensive tackle out of NC State, he's really turned on to be a nice player for Detroit, one of their pillars for their defense. So that and Jonathan Cooper is a late round steal for me in the 6th round, where Brandon Beane picked Rashad Wildgoose, who's no longer he got plucked from the practice squad, and Jonathan Cooper flashed for Denver last year. Those are things that I like. Last year, you and I both stayed with Kyer Elam, and then I stuck with James Cook. But getting Dylan Parham in the 3rd round, man, I wish the Bills did that. I think that's something that I can hang my hat on at least. I mean, he got a chance to play with the Raiders. Obviously, the book's not written on Dylan Parham, but he's on that trajectory to be a nice potential starter for them. So those are some of the things that stand out to me. But I don't know that you could look at any one of us, whether it's me, you, or Brandon Beane, and say, you know what? Clearly the best person has been X. We both have we all three of us have our hits, and we all have our misses as well, which speaks to just how challenging the NFL draft is. And it's an inexact science, and everybody doesn't hit on every pick.
I think this is a unique exercise that we do every year, because I think the more you do it, the more perspective you gain, but it also is really valuable for exactly the reason you just said. Listen, you cannot look at the situation and go, oh, Beane mopped the floor with Marino and Nolan. You can't look at it and say Nolan mopped the floor with Marino and Beane. There's scenarios where you go, okay, I kind of wish this would have gone this way and this would have gone the other way. But even people who do it for a living, there are 3 different levels of professionalism represented by this. There's a GM who does it for a living. There's a content creator who does it for a living, and then there's a content creator who does it for hobbyists. So we're different tiers here, but depending on the pick, you could feel very differently about this one pick that Beane whooped me on, and this one pick that I feel like I got a really good one with Creed Humphrey, where he took Boogie Basham, for example. And so you think to yourself, okay, it's hard. Drafting is really hard. And anyone who says that they have the secret, or they totally would have nailed every single thing, or this is easy, or blah, 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 they're lying, because we have the data now. We have 4 years of past data that shows it's tough to get right.
It certainly is. Bruce, you've been an outstanding guest per usual. For anybody that wants more Bruce, which you should follow him on Twitter at Bruce Exclusive. And of course, the Bruce Exclusive podcast every Thursday on the Buffalo Rumblings Podcast Network. One of my favorite podcasts to listen to. Bruce, really appreciate you doing this. And hopefully we can sync up again next year and go toe-to-toe with Mr. Brandon Beane.
Looking forward to it.
All right, folks. Well, maybe you like Brandon Beane's drafts, or you like my drafts, or you like Bruce's drafts, or you don't like any of them. Well, regardless of where you fall, that's the way the cookie crumbles. I'm Joe Marino, Locked On Bills.